Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes
Arts and Humanities and a professor of English here at the University of Colorado at Boulder. For recording purposes, I want to tell you that today is April 10th, 2024. It is 12:01 p.m. and this is entitled Racial Literacies. This is a panel that discusses these issues. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that the University of Colorado, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work. Educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge. Consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with the tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. The other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to make sure that we hear from all of you. So we will handle Q&A in a sense that at the very end of this, there will be a note card system that is passed around and then brought up to us. We will have a discussion for roughly 40 minutes, and then we'll begin this question and answer with you all. I'd like to begin to thank Jennifer Ho and everyone who has come here together to talk about these issues. I'd like to thank you all for being here to be part of this discussion. Our discussants are from all over the nation, and here, let me introduce them for you. Lee Bebo is a professor of English at Arizona State University, where he is affiliate faculty with the School of Transborder Studies and the program in American Studies. His second book, Whiteness on the Border, New York University Press 2016, examines Mexico, Mexicans, and Mexican Americans have been used to foster whiteness and Americanness, or more accurately, whiteness as Americanness. Jennifer Ho is the daughter of a refugee father from China and an immigrant mother from Jamaica, whose parents themselves were immigrants from Hong Kong, and is also the director of the Center of the Humanities and the Arts upstairs, and the professor of ethnic studies at CU Boulder, where she teaches courses in Asian American culture and critical race theory. Sylvester Johnson, the founding director of the Virginia Tech Center for the Humanities, is a nationally recognized humanities scholar specializing in the study of technology, race, religion, and national security. He is also Associate Vice Provost for Public Interest Technology at Virginia Tech and Executive Director of the university's Tech for Humanity initiative. Cheryl Matias is the full American Educational Research Association. Her research focuses on race theory, critical whiteness studies, critical pedagogy, and feminism of color. We are going to begin with the first question. I'm going to direct it, please, to Jennifer Ho, because she's been very pivotal at putting all of this together. In fact, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her important work. Can you each tell us what the term racial literacy means to you, and how you engage your students, university colleagues, or general community in fostering racial literacy? Jennifer, can you please begin?
Thank you. So I first want to give a shout out to my friend and colleague, Lee, because really it was through working and talking with Lee in various ventures that made us want to collaborate on an NEH proposal, National Endowment for the Humanities, and we envisioned a 2-week summer institute that would bring faculty together to talk about and learn about various forms of racial literacy. And the idea was literacy, and there's many forms of literacy. There's language literacy, financial literacy, math literacy. Just simply is a tool in which you can be conversant on a particular subject. And our thought was we wanted to be able to provide a toolkit, if you will, to faculty regardless of their area. And to allow them to learn from one another and from the texts. Sadly, it didn't get funded, but I did take that germ of an idea and brought it to John Michael and another one of our co-organizers who can't be here sadly today, Kirk Ambrose, who is director of the Center for Teaching and Learning here at CU Boulder. And we applied to the Dean's Innovation Grant and received money so that we could create a racial literacies collaborative group here at CU Boulder. And the lights are too bright for me to recognize whether there are any members of racial literacies in the audience, but I think there are. And so we have been meeting about once a month, starting in the fall semester, to talk about race, racism, and anti-racism. We read a book called On Critical Race Theory by Victor Ray. And then in the spring semester, we wanted to engage with works of leading scholars, which has led us all to this panel today.
Would anyone else like to address that question, or would you like me to repeat it?
If you want to repeat it, and just for the audience, and then I'll maybe jump in a little bit.
So, can each of you tell us what the term racial literacy means to you and how you engage your students, university colleagues, or general community in fostering this literacy?
So, I guess I'll say that I came to be thinking about racial literacy about 15 years or so ago at my first institution. I'm a white guy that teaches in the field of Chicano and Latino studies, and I was noticing something that I wasn't expecting when I was teaching my Chicano studies classes is that, my Latino students would be really engaged and interested in the material, but a lot of times my white students would kind of pull back and not engage. And I learned after a while that they weren't sure how to engage because for a lot of them, they hadn't learned to talk about race in mixed settings before. So for me, racial literacy is about developing a set of skills, not just to speak, but also to listen to one another. And it's a way of empowering students or friends or colleagues, or in my case, my kiddo, to engage with one another. It gives an ability to think through how we communicate about what can be a really thorny and difficult topic.
I'll jump in here. Good afternoon, buenos tardes, everyone. Just wanted to say I come from the discipline of education, and oftentimes when I draw from racial literacy, I think of Yolanda Seeley Ruiz, who's over at Columbia University, who talks a lot about the archaeology of the self, which is the excavation of your own identities and how you come into awareness to race. Well, I draw from that when I started here. Actually, I started my first academic career here at University of Colorado, Denver, and I was teaching at the Urban Teacher Education Program, the first ever faculty of color hired to teach in that program. And I, like Lee, have had the similar experience where you had a lot of students coming from Littleton, from different areas of Colorado, ready to teach urban teacher education, code word, Black and brown students. And the same situation happened where, having been trained in critical race theory at UCLA for my doctoral work, it wasn't registering the same way as it was doing when I taught in different institutions inside California. So I had to really rethink, is CRT enough to have white students understand the dynamics of race? And I figured that that was not enough. They had to understand the element of whiteness And particularly in the work that I do in the field of education is that of the emotionalities of whiteness and how emotions can be racialized so much so that it really impacts the learning. I guess in education we call it an affective filter when we're trying to learn another language and we feel very scared to try to speak it because we're scared we're going to say it wrong. The same thing can happen with our racialized emotions. And so when I thought about racial literacy and bringing us to awareness in the Paulo Freire kind of sense, right? I had to really think about how is it that these students from Colorado are understanding how they've been racialized as white and why they feel the need to quote unquote help save or serve communities that they know not of. And so we really investigated how whiteness and their emotions came about and why they even entered that program in the first place. And I can get into that later, but I think that is particularly where I'm coming from in terms of an education background. How might I be able to teach someone of something they think they don't know, but when we actually go into it, I'm like, well, why don't you drive through 5 Points? They actually do know.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks for this question. I think about literacy in the terms of being functional, and certainly all of us are working in academic contexts, and our students are coming through our academic institutions, and then they're going out to do whatever they're going to do beyond that. And we also, in different ways, engage publicly with audiences that are not necessarily academic audiences around the significance of race as a very real force throughout society. And so I think a lot about this as an important way of getting people to understand in a functional way, to interpret the world they live in, to be able to identify how they're participating and are affected by a world that is racialized deeply beyond the common tropes and popular ways of thinking about race. So race is very counterintuitive in the way that some other things are counterintuitive. Gender is counterintuitive. Sexuality is counterintuitive. It looks like one thing. Money is counterintuitive. People often think of money as something they have in their pocket, and it's actually something else entirely different. That stands for money, but you don't have money in your pocket. And so with race, it is important, I think, to address the fact that if we just go out in society on a day-to-day basis and consume popular media, the messages that we'll get about what race is and our place in it is typically quite different from what's actually going on. You know, we're taught to think that race is inside of us, that we're born with it, that it's natural, and that there are people in this group over here and there are people in the group over there, and the reality is that if you fly to another country, you might have a different racial identity assigned to you. It just depends on that country, on its social systems, and your own formation. And it changes over time, and it's intersectional, and it's affected by lots of other things. And those are so counterintuitive. So I think there's not only the need to help people to become functionally literate around race in the way that we would want people to do that with reading and with math, so that they can actually function, they can live in our society in a way that helps them to thrive and be thoughtful about what they're doing. But we also have to attend to that in a way that addresses that counterintuitiveness. And so all of us have had to address that, some of the unlearning, where people come in with certain kind of common sense assumptions that have to be engaged artfully in a way to help people to understand the complexities that shape what's really going on. And so I think about the literacy in that way. It's being functional. Doesn't mean you're going to be an expert now in race. I think this is something that people just need to be able to learn about. And then there's that counterintuitive layer with it. There's having to help people to think beyond some of the quote unquote common sense thinking that we've all gotten used to in order to better understand what's actually going on.
So John Michael, can you tell us? Because we were hoping that this would be more conversational in the roundtable. So I'd like to know your answer about racial literacy.
I think one of the big things that are occurring today is within our very diverse democracy and what is now going to become an even greater diverse democracy over the next 10, 20 years. For me, racial literacy is actually a fundamental, I could say, a skill, an active participation to be a democratic citizen, right? That to understand the other, to understand many others that are not you, is going to be central for us to make sure that our democracy holds together, that we respect the opinions, the insights, the knowledges of different people, and yet try to come together in this very interesting experiment of democracy we have in the United States. So that, for me, then it's a absolute skill that's paramount, that it will be very important for us as we change over the next few years.
Well, I guess I would absolutely agree with what everyone has said on this panel. And maybe we can get to the subtitle for the roundtable, which is how to talk, teach, and learn about race, racism, and anti-racism. And I guess I'm interested in how all of us continue our education. Because I think one of the things I get is that people look at me as a teacher, as a scholar of critical race studies, and assume I'm an expert. And what I actually say to people is that my education is ongoing. And I learn from people all the time through conversation, hearing people's stories, right? I'm a humanist, I was trained as a literary scholar, I'm very much interested in people's stories. And people's stories are going to contradict one another. So for example, I'm the kind of Asian American that feels a little bit ruffled if people ask me where I'm from, and they don't just mean like, are you from Boulder, Colorado? So if you're an Asian American in this country, you have likely gotten the question, where are you from? What are you? And I really hate what are you, because that makes me feel like I'm a different species. And then if I answer, I live in Boulder, Colorado, and someone says, no, where are you really from? What I am hearing is that I'm somehow not quite a legitimate American, right? Like somehow my presence here in this space needs to be further contextualized. And I also understand that there are people who ask that question and that's not what they mean. So there is this kind of disconnect between what I'm hearing in the question and what someone who's asking the question may mean. And I'm bringing this up because there are other Asian people in America who are totally fine with that question. In fact, invite that question, want to talk about their ethnic origins, their immigration story, and don't hear it as a microaggression or a macroaggression. And so there's not, that's the other thing, there's not one way to be Asian American or to understand race and racism. And so that's something I always try and keep in mind, that I have certain preferences and an understanding based on my identity and based on my scholarship, but different people are going to bring different things to their awareness and understanding of race and racism. So I'm curious about everyone else.
I guess it's funny. My dissertation back in the day was actually named "Where Are You Really From?" Back and it's funny because I study whiteness, so I often analyze how we understand someone's intent may not be the actual impact, but there's a difference between intent and impact, and to understand the two. And in fact, in whiteness studies, intent alone was a way to uphold white supremacy, right? In court cases, right? We're seeing when you're trying to try for racial discrimination, you need to prove intent of the perpetrator, right? That they intended to be racist or racially discriminatory, right? But yet you look at other issues like murder or rape, and intent shows the severity of the punishment, not to undergird the argument altogether. So intent is actually socialized for us to realize that it's become a strategic maneuver of whiteness for whites to absolve themselves immediately from any racial doings. So the intent, someone to say, well, that was not my intent. Well, thank you, but the impact is this. So I always try to, but I'm the kind of person, so I'm from LA, and I used to live here in Colorado. And people would ask me, where are you from? I say, I'm from LA. No, where are you really from? I'm like Kaiser Permanente Hospital, Sunset Boulevard, maternity ward. But and that's for real. But I think it's always interesting to see here, to play with the dynamics of how whiteness works in a unidirectional manner. So when I ask back, no, where are you from, Chad? And Chad would reply, I'm from Ohio. I'm like, Ohio? No, 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 no. Where are you really from? Ireland? How do you speak English so well? You know, and they laugh, just as you all did. But that shows how unidirectional race happens, right? It becomes so natural as a lion eats a gazelle. It's so natural in patriarchy when the man says when you're on your period, right? To substantiate a woman's emotions, right? So it becomes something really interesting when I'm trying to learn or teach or talk about race or racism, because in my own education, it's a constant, it's a constant push and pull, you know? And I even get it with my children, because I have a saying when all their friends come over, I said, no sex, no drugs, no alcohol, no racism, and homophobia. And then my daughter said, so sexism is okay. I was like, so it becomes how I learn is always understanding how in critical race theory, you know, Derek Bell talks about the permanence of race, not in a nihilistic kind of way, but he's talking about it in a way that it'll always mutate. It will always evolve in a way that we're moving in a society. So it's really interesting that the way I teach, racism has continued to move. But the saddest thing is whenever I teach whiteness courses and show about the naturalness of whiteness, is that I'm always able to draw from some type of social event or public event that can clearly explain it. And that's the saddest, whether it's talking about how white mass shooters at Littleton were compared to other shooters at Virginia Tech with Cho. He being Asian American, the assumption that he didn't get into better schools like his sister, right? And then you see other shooters, and they racialize that narrative as well. So it becomes a very interesting thing to teach this, but the saddest thing for me is to know that there's always examples in our public life.
I guess as I'm thinking about our own education around race, racism, and anti-racism, how it's ongoing, the thing that strikes me is how the examples that both Jennifer and Cheryl offered create an opportunity for somebody to speak back and say, well, where are you from? Chad from Ohio. And I think what's changed for me over the years is really realizing that there is not one way of responding. There's multiple ways of responding. The way I respond is going to be taken differently than the way Cheryl's and vice versa. So there's that dynamic because our bodies are read as texts. That is a part of racial literacy. But then there's also, you know, how do we respond and how do we engage with somebody? And how does it meet the goals of the moment? Is this somebody that I really know and want to engage with and really want to kind of pull on a string and try to have a deep conversation with them either at that moment or later? Or is it somebody that I just want to make them think? Or maybe it's somebody I just want them to stop what they're doing. And I think years ago, I always thought, well, there is one response to this, and that's just to call it out. And that is an acceptable response. But there are numerous responses and numerous ways of calling people out, calling people in. So that's my immediate inclination, is to think about that.
Can I actually jump in and say, I think you're right about context, and I do think, as much as I really hate that question, I do try and take a step back when I get the question, because I think, so for example, after 9/11, I was asked that question 2 different times by 2 different people. And in the first instance, it was a white older man at Mount Holyoke's library, and I played this game, right, where he said, where are you from? I said, I live in South Hadley. No, where are you really from? I grew up in California. Where were you born? I was born in New York City, right? We go on and on and on. Until finally he got to the question that would give him the answer he wanted, which is, what is your ancestry? And I said, Chinese. And then he said, ni hao ma to me, right? And then, And I think I said Chinese American, and he said, oh, good, you're a US citizen. Again, after 9/11, right? The context is really important, and then he says, ni hao ma, and I just basically said, you know, estoy aprendiendo español, and then walked away. The second time it happened, the next week, I have a needle in my arm because I'm giving blood, and the white nurse, Red Cross nurse, says, oh, what's your nationality? And I'm not gonna fuss, right? Because the Red Cross nurse has a needle in my arm, and I say Chinese American, and her eyes light up, and she says, my granddaughter's Chinese, and every night she asks me, Grandma, did you see anyone that looks like me? And that's right? That context is wildly different. And that was such an important education, you know, talking about education, that was such an important education for me to like wait a beat. And then we had a fantastic conversation about resources for her granddaughter. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, for me, I think that you're asking us how our own engagement with this and learning has been ongoing. For me, there's been a much deeper appreciation for the role of technology and race in its impact on global populations. You know, in the U.S., it has become very familiar now to talk about racial and ethnic bias and gender bias in technology, even though that tends to be focusing more on the U.S. and less understanding how that plays out globally. But I've come to appreciate much more the role of technology. I've come to also appreciate more fully the need to engage not just our students and other scholarly colleagues, but more publicly in the U.S. to engage more with race as a global system. And that's everything from how we understand its inner workings to how we propose solutions. Because my own context, I grew up in the U.S., studied about race in a very U.S.-centered way. I've realized the need to take account of its global formations. And in thinking about, for example, with inequality, so inequality is all over the place. You know, it's in our neighborhoods, it's local and global at the same time. So it's not trivializing anything. It's just that the wealth disparities that exist globally are so extreme. And they tend not to factor into most of the discussions about race and inequality that have been part of my formation as a scholar. And so I've definitely learned to pay much greater attention to those things and to think about solution spaces in a way that is accountable to those global dimensions of inequality because they're so severe. And it's, you know, we have neighborhoods and communities in the U.S. That are disenfranchised, but they're entire nations and states and regions that are disenfranchised from the ability to participate in the global economy. And that's only becoming more dire. So those are things I've tried to actually, I've had help learning to pay greater attention to and thinking through for how that affects the teaching that I do, the scholarship that I produce.
So I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that at the very time the government and the U.S. Census is defining that the demographic shifts are occurring dramatically in our country, they are also asking us to stop talking about race. Through legislation, through laws. University of Texas just fired and repurposed 60 positions in DEI just last Friday. And this week, other universities and government institutions are following suit. At the same time that the U.S. Census is spending millions of dollars to count the changing demographic of the United States. This is really, really important. This is occurring at the exact same time. That said, what do you all feel are the greatest challenges in our current moment in the U.S. for doing anti-racism work?
How many more minutes we have?
Yeah, 11.
If I could, I kind of want to jump in with a question that goes back and then maybe forward here, because I listened to Sylvester talk about technology, and John Michael, I hear you talk about how we're being asked not to talk about race. I've got a kiddo who loves TikTok. He's 14. and Instagram, or Snapchat, all the things that I'm not on. And I'm going to try and not take this as a, get off my lawn approach. But he's constantly exposed to racial humor that I would say is, at the very least, problematic, particularly through some friends on Snapchat, but on TikTok. And to my job as a parent is, I think I've got to help him cultivate a sense of racial literacy to figure out why that's supposed to be funny, why it might not be funny, et cetera, et cetera. But now I'm listening to Sylvester, and I'm like, what do we do with that type of technology? I mean, that's a technology that is spreading these racial narratives. It's not starting them by any stretch of the imagination. And at the same time, we're facing this moment where we're largely forbidden in K through 12 from having serious and meaningful conversations about race and media literacy, let alone racial literacy. So what do we do with that? Help me be a better parent.
You can buy the DVD for $19.99. Actually, the DVDs are not. Do you even have a DVD player anymore? You can. You can follow me on TikTok right now. No. Yeah. I think that's really great. It's important because these are very complicated things. I don't know. We have lots of quandaries in front of us, and yeah, the social media is really powerful. I do think we need to. I think academics need to become much more skillful in collaborating. Maybe we hire some young influencers and work with them in order to leverage the power of social media. So one of the things that I've become interested in is given what is a very real movement of censorship and the destruction of free speech practices in the U.S., the government control and censorship of teaching. So you mentioned that Texas and Florida, lots of states around the U.S. It's not just one region of the U.S. where we're seeing this, and their efforts to try to make that national. So there's a real possibility that this could be federally imposed. That's not something that could never happen, and there would be real consequences. And so all the more reason, I think, to leverage other kinds of platforms and systems, because people are getting access to media impacts not just through schools. Most of that is outside of school. Well, how do we leverage that as educators, as people who want to advance public knowledge and understanding? And so I think that has to be part of it. But it is I think one of the biggest threats we face, I think, is what seems to be a very successful movement in literally criminalizing the ability to teach and to learn about race and about other structural, systemic forms of inequality, and literally criminalize. That's happening, and this is just the beginning of it. And there's an attempt to do it both on the educator side and also to deprive the learner of those things. And I'm not suggesting we give up on our educational institutions and give our lectures just on TikTok. I'm saying that we need multiple strategies while we're fighting to preserve their right. But I think I would say that's probably the biggest threat right now. Once people can be criminalized for teaching about this, it's another level of dangerous.
Under the auspice that we have a colorblind society, democracies themselves are based upon abstract citizens, and therefore therefore to talk about race is to disentangle the democratic project, and versus the other way around is to actually talk about our differences, to then acknowledge them, right, and to then become a more pluralistic society.
Having been in teacher education and the training of teachers for over 25 years, and having been a classroom teacher myself in Brooklyn and South Central Los Angeles, I think there's a lot of challenges to education, especially doing, and I don't use the word anti-racist, but I like to be for something, not just against something, for racially just work and racially just teaching. But I recently would say one of the biggest things I can come out and say this now, I chaired the Education Transitional Committee for the Biden campaign and for the teacher diversity in K-12 DEI efforts. And hearing from the national folks and talking about, for example, the executive order that Trump instituted that banned CRT, right? It's like the boogeyman. I thought that's not the greatest challenge. The greatest challenge for me was white emotionalities and how they get weaponized to protect a certain few. I do remember when I was an associate professor that I wrote an IRB, and after already gaining tenure and knowing what I study, IRB pushed back because they knew I was interviewing white teachers. And they promoted white teachers to a protected status because they didn't want to feel hurt about learning about their own internalized racism. And I thought that is really interesting, how we can get to a point where someone's emotions can be used in such a way that can cause harm to other people. And this is nothing new. I mean, we saw this happen with Emmett Tillman years ago, and Carolyn Bryant even admitted to lying all these years, right, about what happened to Emmett Till. This happens again with the Central Park 5. It happened again with Amanda Cooper and the Central Park dog situation, right? Leash your dog. So we're seeing right now the greatest challenge is how one emotion is being prioritized over the humanity of us all. And we're seeing that in education, especially in K-12, like Temecula Unified is trying to, quote unquote, protect the feelings of hurt white students. But then they're not realizing that there's been a lot of students of color who've been hurting for a long time with Eurocentric curriculum. So it's really interesting now in this climate, the challenges that are happening are is a really perverse reversal of who is truly being victimized in this state in education.
I mean, I agree with everything everyone has said, and especially the criminalization piece. I mean, I think that we tend to put higher education on a pedestal. I mean, we talk about higher education as an ivory tower because we think that we're the scholars who are going to solve the world's problems, whether that's climate change or, clean water. And I think the thing I'm most concerned about is that we're at a point where we can't agree on facts. And if we can't agree on facts, I don't know what to do about that. So in other words, I'm perfectly fine agreeing to disagree with someone. I can have a different political point of view. I can have different thoughts about abortion, for example. I have friends who are not pro-choice, and they have certain ethical and moral reasons for that, and we can agree to disagree. I don't know what to do when people are, it's like someone who would truly believe that the earth is flat, right? There are people who truly believe that the earth is flat. So what do you do with someone where in the face of scientific evidence will tell you that something is different? And so when we're talking about media and technology and education, like one of the things that really worries me are things like Prager University. And I don't know if everyone has heard of or knows about what Prager University is, but they are an online, I think, university, and they put out these educational videos that they're now using in the state of Florida. And it's essentially rewriting US history. It's one of the reasons Ron DeSantis can come out and say that there were good things that emerged through the condition of the transatlantic slavery and that enslaved people learned skills, and that is a net positive somehow of the condition of slavery. And again, it's so disturbing to me that there will be students who will get their history from Prager University, and it is my most generous way of putting it is perverted sense of US history. And which means that we are now creating a condition in which students are learning things as fact that are quite simple, there's no evidence for.
So we're at the end of our discussion, and though we have other questions we can discuss, but I believe we have questions from the audience, or perhaps to address and engage you all. Yeah, and then while we're doing that, one thing I would like to talk about, because the inverse of that as well is, as you all have heard, to talk about race, to have a panel like this, is in itself inherently breaking democracy up, because it's by bringing it as such a big discourse, as an ideology of that becomes, that's everything by which we understand each other, versus we are just humans, understand their merit, the character, the bootstrap mentality, and that's how we should understand and be, be one nation, because anytime you talk about that. That's an interesting way, because that's also a discussion about race. And that's putting a particular, I guess you can say, constraint on a discussion also that's no different than, for example, the government saying you can't teach DEI. It's saying you can't talk about race, because once you talk about it, you're always already going to end up in a divisive situation. So they both ask and answer, right? So that's not really a dialogue. But that said, though, what do y'all think about that, the multiple ways that race is being deployed in social media, in politics, in other areas, weaponized, and how does literacy become a way for us to deal with the facts of race at the same time that they're being, manipulated by think tanks and so forth, to teach people how to talk about race or not talk about it at all? That was a long question. There's probably better ones on this panel.
There certainly are. I think the example that Jennifer, you just gave, I was not familiar with this Prager University, by the way. I'm glad you raised that. I will find out about this, because that's a very clear and deeply troubling example of the use of the digital media, digital technology, in this case, to present counterfactual information.
Just wait until you see the Booker T. Washington video.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And so, that's just one thing. There are lots of counterfactual claims, accounts that go out on social media. You were talking about flat Earth. There's a flat earther movement, as you're aware of. So you're right. There are people who are actually making this claim. And when you consider the emergence of legislative efforts in numerous states to protect what's called intellectual diversity. So this protection of diversity is happening at the same time that diversity of peoples is being criminalized, the teaching of that. But when you pair that with protecting intellectual diversity, then you end up in a situation, if I'm a science teacher, I have to give equal space and time to creationism, as I do to teaching students about the evolutionary history of the planet. And so you're back in this situation where you have a sort of a post-fact world or a post-truth world. Everything is just supposed to be a perspective.
So, perhaps a hopeful question here. In the U.S., where are we with racism in the upcoming generations? Is racial literacy better in the younger generation, the students we teach? Have we seen a change over time? I've been teaching for 20 years. Or do old people just get out of the way? Or should old people just get out of the way?
What constitutes us old?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
All boomers, according to.
But that's a really interesting question. Have we seen changes? I taught a class a long time ago. Again, it was called Against Race, playing off of the book, and we were kind of what it was literally during the Obama era is when I was teaching this, and it was really interesting discussions and debates about race. They were interesting. This was about 15, 12 years ago. That were very refreshing and much more honest than what they would be today and what I dealt with recently. And I'm not sure if that's because of social media and being afraid to talk about things in a safe space. The phones weren't in the room at that time. They were, but not like they are now. And so therefore there's a much more, perhaps the younger generations or our generations now that are younger have more forward thinking to talk about things, but I'm not sure if they have the tools or the ability or the comfort to do it in a classroom where anyone can tape anyone.
Oh, that's a great point. That is so sharp. I didn't even think about the taping aspect of it. I always caution against the generational argument of it, because if we could just count on generations to solve our problems, then racism would have been wrong.
It would have been fixed a long time ago. Like,
Yeah,
what did we do?
Yeah, so I always worry about that. The other thing that I would point to is that across generations, white folks tend to live and socialize in enclaves. And so they don't have experiences, by and large, on the aggregate, talking about race in multiracial settings and learning from other folks' experiences. And so I think that's what we need to cultivate, are those opportunities for just getting outside those segregated bubbles that we still live in. I mean, we know that legal segregation has ended in the United States, but we still have largely segregated schools. We have segregated churches, and we don't call them that, but think about your social networks. If you're a white person in this room, think about your social networks. How often do you actually spend time meaningfully with communities of color? And until I'm not saying it's the only thing that'll solve these issues, but until we start chipping away at that, I think to me, that's a critical crux. But I'd be interested in other perspectives on that too.
He was asking, can you repeat the question? But it was about the generationalism.
Yeah, do you feel that there's, to Lee's point, generational changes, if you will, but also is there something about today's generation, the youth of today? Are we hopeful at all on how they're dealing or discussing race? Or are we just looking at the different, the mediums, the message? I kind of always say, the particular technology of the time reflects a generation rather than the generation per se, right? So, how they communicate is so basically humans don't change, technology changes. And so, they're very pessimistic, please forgive me. But is there perhaps hope, if you will, on this, or not, or are we where we are?
According to critical race theorist Derek Bell in his book, Faces of the Bottom of the Well, hope is always here, right? Without hope, then why are we even in this panel, right? And his chapter 3, Afrolantica, really gets at that, because the hope is embedded in the humanity and the struggle, not in the hope for some false utopia that never exists. But I do want to talk a little bit about, because I've written a lot about this, that we have, I'm going to not say generation, but I'm going to talk about a period. We've really come out of a period of colorblind racism. I think that was a very characteristic of the 80s and 90s and so forth, but we've come into a period where I call an emboldened epistemology of whiteness, where it's almost emboldened to be a racist, right? I mean, you even have white supremacists. If you ask them, are you a racist? They said, no, we just believe whites are superior. So you're getting people even obscured with what defines a racist, right? So in this day and age, you're seeing people do this reverse victimization. You're seeing them feel emboldened to say, I'm being discriminated against, or I have a right to do this, like you saw in the Kentucky County Clerk office, right, when she refused to give a marriage certificate to a gay couple, right? She said she started to liken herself to Martin Luther King, claiming religious rights. And you're seeing this really perverse co-option and reappropriation of what was considered concepts, actions, and terminologies that were first used in the civil rights movement to support people of color and other diverse peoples, right? And you're seeing it co-opted to say, hey, we're the real social justice workers because we are being oppressed to be just who we are, which is white. So you're kind of like, what? What the heck is going on here? So I think when we talk about generations, regardless of whether, I mean, all of us are boomers, according to my kids anyway, you know? It doesn't matter if you're Gen X or anything. But I think what we really need to understand is there's periods of racial evolution, right, that is happening right now, such that we're not, I think people know you can't act colorblind, but they're acting in a very twisted, perverse way of being color conscious. So we really have to understand what that consciousness constitutes. Can I give a, because I'm an educator, I don't want to leave you like lacking hope, but here's some tools, pedagogical tools on how you can engage race in the classroom. I have like 3 big ones that I always do. I always ask my students in a Post-it, what can we not talk about race? And put it in the Post-it paper and then throw it in the front of the room. And then pick it up and read it and say, why can't we talk about this? And guess what? You're talking about race. Another avenue is when I talk about whiteness and emotionalities, right? I tell my students, especially if it's a predominantly PWI, I ask my students, okay, everyone take out your notes. You're not going to take a picture of the board because I'm going to erase it. I ask them to all write in their notebooks, give me a list as to why you don't talk to Uncle Joe about race at the dinner table when he comes to visit. And they go off. They start talking about, oh, he's going to say that's yesteryear. He's the one who's being oppressed. He lost a job to a black guy. He's going to, he's going to go off. He's going to say, why are you attacking me? He's going to say, prove it, all of this thing, right? And I say, okay, great. Now that you identified some common white emotionalities, we're going to go read the syllabus. And anytime you feel like Uncle Joe, check yourself before you wreck your own learning. So that's another pedagogical tool that you guys can engage. And I think the biggest thing is stop teaching from an epistemological frame that whites don't understand. Eduardo Bonilla Silva said whites have mastered semantic maneuvers of talking about race, right? The late great Charles Mills, has talked a lot about how whites have been masters of the narrative, right? He even says that this epistemology of ignorance is a falsity, right? It's actually an active way to thwart culpability. And so we need to start teaching race as, look, it doesn't start at racism, it starts at white supremacy, which impacts us all, albeit very differently, just like patriarchy impacts us all, albeit differently from genders or how you're identified, right? So it becomes really interesting when we teach it from this way. Stop acting like you don't know, you've been known. And so if you start focusing on that, then we can actually engage in a deeper thought about race.
I just wanted to jump in because I know Cheryl's a teacher educator. I know we're all educators, but it's critical to recognize that this type of education doesn't just happen in the classrooms. And I think you're fully aware of that, right? And so when Cheryl, I think when you're saying when you're a teacher, do this, that doesn't mean just as a teacher. It just means as a communicator, right? Yeah. So.
Actually, I wanted to also put in a plug for my center, the Center for Humanities and the Arts, because one of the signature programs we do is called the Difficult Dialogues. One of our community advisory board members, Pedro Silva, has said, if you can't talk about it, you can't fix it. And I think that's really true, that there's so much fear that people are going to say, right? People have a fear that they're going to say the wrong thing or they're not going to use the right terminology. I think as far as our students are concerned, I'm super grateful social media was not around, or like having a mini computer that could record me was around, because I said really dumb stuff when I was between the ages of 18 and 24 before my prefrontal cortex grew in. And I think, so there is also a kind of, cognitive evolutionary thing about this, that we need to be able to make mistakes. I mean, I think that's the other thing, right? This is why I think there's a question about how our own education is ongoing, because I don't say everything perfectly, I make mistakes, but I also try to apologize. And I think that's the other thing that's also part of racial literacies, is that when you make a mistake, to be able to say, I'm really sorry. How can I make amends? how can I mitigate the harm that I've created? And I think we get so caught up in our pride or our embarrassment or our shame that we're not able to recognize that we've hurt someone, and that saying like a genuine apology goes a long way.
So I
Can
want
I
to
bring up this
sorry.
last question? The last question on our sheet was, why is racial literacy important? If someone said that the answer to racism is to stop talking about race, what would you say? And I get this a lot, even from my own like interracial family. And it's funny because as much as I want to stop talking about cancer and hoping it'll just go away in my body, it's not going to happen. So why is it that we think that racism will go away without talking about race? We're taught as parents to talk about sex, drugs, and all of this stuff. So why would we actually believe not talking about race would ever stop, racism? So I think it's just, we need to step back every so often when we hear these things and be like, how illogical. Make whiteness abnormal, make racism abnormal.
So what happens when, and this gets to the heart of this question, is can you talk about colorism and the role of colorism in the U.S. and how they differ based on one's location? And here I kind of take it a different step further. What happens if we are in a United States within 5 years where half the country you can't talk about race? You can't acknowledge the question that you just asked, the number 5 question. And then you have another half of the country that is asking about the particular questions of colorism or race. What then, when the country stops talking, or they talk differently about a fundamental aspect of humanity? Perhaps that also lies within what are the directions, perhaps, that will lead to us combating that particular reality that is almost with us. But how do we deal with that? When race is going to be realized and discussed fundamentally different, leave the states to make the decisions of abortion. Leave the states to decide. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's the narrative of the Supreme Court. Let the states define, how we discuss race. What happens then to a country that can't talk the same language?
Aren't we already there? Yeah.
Sorry, I think we're all silent because we are, because I think we are there. I'm on Facebook because I'm an oldster, and I have a friend from high school who has very different political beliefs and beliefs about race and racism than I do. And we try to conduct this experiment through COVID because we got reconnected on Facebook, where we would try and have discussions. I know, dumb, seriously, about our different points of view. And it just became really clear to me that we were consuming such different media. And I didn't know how to, so after January 6th, he sent me a photo of the shaman guy. I don't know what his name, the guy was.
He's from Tempe, Arizona. We know about
Awesome, okay. Yeah. And he said, Jennifer, these are crisis actors, right? These are people put in by the Biden campaign to make Donald Trump look bad. And
false flag.
Yeah, a false flag event. And I thought, we're watching the same news, and this was actually as it was unfolding. And I just thought, I don't know how to talk about this with him because I'm experiencing such a different reality. Like, we're watching the same images and we're coming to such different conclusions. And so, and that's, again, part of the literacy part. You can't, I think, talk to people. I can't talk to somebody, if somebody's speaking Mandarin to me and they speak no English and I speak no Mandarin, despite what I look like, we can't communicate, and that's what it feels like.
We have to have a shared language.
We have to have a shared language.
And go back to what you said earlier, shared facts of some sort, even if they're small facts.
Yeah, I think that's, what you just said, all of you just said is really articulate response to the question you're asking, what happens when some people cannot actually learn about, are not actually learning about race. They're not getting this literacy. And others are. It is definitely, I think, a gulf that could become much worse with the possible emergence of what's called deep fakes that will be far more realistic than anything most of us have ever seen before. And you're talking about watching something in real time. It's quite possible in a few months, not years, that many of us will begin to see things that will be told not to believe because it's something that what's not actually happening. And even though you can see the video, you can hear those actions. And when you put that on top of the inability for people to teach or learn about systemic structural things that are real, that are happening, that have been going on for a long time, that continue to happen, the desire, and it's not an accident that this political movement is going on to criminalize the teaching and learning of race and other structural systems. It's to create the outcome. The outcome is that students don't learn about it. A lot of your population never hears about this. And it furthers a certain political outcome. And it becomes impossible, I think, to have not only a set of common conversations, but a set of common actions that can actually address the problems in our society. And it's crippling. And it can lead to other things. It could lead to very organized territorial forms of trying to protect whatever those things are happening. You get these civil divisions. You no longer have a United States. You can have some balkanization going on. So I agree. You definitely have to have facts, and we have to. If we continue down the line of perspectivism, you have a perspective, everyone has a perspective. Let's just treat all perspectives equally. And I want to say that heart disease is caused by breathing oxygen because it's my perspective, and that should be as valid as someone else's perspective. That just makes no sense. That's something we have to reject. And even if some people don't like it. So I think otherwise we do lose the ability to actually take action in our own lives.
This is where I make a plug for the humanities, obligatorily, I guess, but you say, you can make that opinion that, heart disease is caused by breathing oxygen, that's your perspective. I often tell students that they can't tell me that, a poem by Robert Frost is about Neil Armstrong landing on the moon. And sometimes I'll get a student say, well, that's my opinion, man. And I'm like, give me the evidence. And this is, the humanities, I don't think it's a mistake that we have seen a lack of funding in the humanities or a retrenchment of funding in humanities education. At the same time, we're seeing threats to democracy and understandings of commonly understood factual aspects. January 6th, flat earth, whatever. Yeah.
So how did we get here? From 2020 summer, Black Lives Matter, where everyone started talking about race in very open ways. We started really asking ourselves questions about the institutions of race in very explicit ways. Everyone was really, it really fundamentally changed a lot of things. And Me Too as well, right? These kind of moments where, and then now we're here to where legislation is being created to fire and to dismantle and to ban books, right? More banning of books now than ever, right? We know how we got here, but let's contemplate a little bit about, is this just simply a reactionary blip, and in 3-4 years we'll move on to something else, or is this a fundamental reaction or shift and entrenchment, a division because of media and technology that has changed things as well, because of how governments are trying to understand that to control a very vast democracy with lots of different opinions, you control how critical inquiry is asked, right? It's much easier to to control a large population that's diverse, that doesn't ask questions, than it is the other way around. Thoughts?
Yeah, we got here by a combination of factors. You know, it's dark money, lots of invested capital to create think tanks, nonprofits tied to for-profits, to queue up people to run for office, to introduce certain policies and school boards, local school boards, to prepare people to run for state and federal level candidates, to change our college campuses. There are multiple organizations on colleges, university campuses that train students to sit in the classrooms, and when you hear this professor talking about race or sexuality, let us know. We will organize doxing. We'll get a lawsuit against that university. We'll sue them. We have an entire cadre of attorneys that are waiting. So it's very organized, and it's a political vision that is very well financed, and it's not necessarily reducible to those strategies, but it certainly has not been a kind of an accident where we're just drifting in a certain direction. It's very organized, it's very well funded, and what I would call more pro-democratic efforts to, I think it's striking that in a nation that, at least for the time being, still publicly elevates the idea of democracy. Maybe that will shift, but for the time being, most people in this country will say that they think democracy is a good thing. And in that country, we are criminalizing diversity and inclusion in a democracy. Hey, what does it mean to have a democracy if you're criminalizing inclusion? But we're doing it, then I think you have to take seriously the asymmetry between the highly organized and highly funded efforts to take away rights and to attack not just humanities. The scientists are concerned now. And we saw that during COVID, that scientific experts were attacked because they were experts. And then the asymmetry between that and what's the organized strategy and funding for pro-democracy movements that are trying to elevate possibilities for more inclusion and to protect free speech, to protect the ability of people to come together and learn about things. Maybe it upsets them, that's fine. You know, people get upset about all kinds of things. I got upset when someone told us we have a leak in our basement. But at least they fixed it, right? Yeah, it was troubling, I didn't like it, but I'm glad we found out and we fixed that problem. So things will be disturbing, but there is asymmetry between those two things. And I think our ability to get to a point where we can actually rectify these problems will require that not to maintain asymmetry. There has to be more resources to support these pro-democracy movements.
And just to end with that hope, if you will, that moment of discussion that we're having today, the audience and the questions they're asking today, that's what we have to continue to do. Yeah. Have these discussions, apologize, recognize, and move forward, but we can only do it through the continued pushing of how we engage other people and understand our roles in the world as we go forward. Thank you all very much for being here today.
Thanks, everyone.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.